Hello, my name is Gareth Russell and welcome to The Life of Anne Boleyn. I hope to do a series of short videos on different aspects of history that I've written about previously in the hope that they offer a brief distraction to people who are in lockdown or social distancing over the next few weeks or months. These are rough around the edges and ad hoc. Obviously, in a video overview as well, it's not possible to cover every aspect of Anne's life or her reputation, but there may also, I hope, be a few things which are unfamiliar to you and provide some interest. I can't footnote or endnote things in a video which I realise could be frustrating for some people if there are some things they're unfamiliar with, but do please feel free to comment if you have any questions, and I will try to get back to you on that. Everything I've included in this video is backed up by research and many happy years spent studying the Boleyns and the Tudor monarchy as well. Whether you are familiar with the Tudor story, or here to learn something about a name you've heard many times but would like to know more about, I hope this rudimentary video entertains and informs. Henry VIII was King of England for 38 years from 1509 until his death in 1547. He inherited the throne from his father Henry VII, and at the time of his succession, young Henry was a handsome and athletic 17-year-old. Things do change. Over the course of the next 4 decades, his weight increased substantially to give us the images millions are familiar with from the portraits by Hans Holbein painted later in Henry VIII's life. By the time Henry died, he left his country grappling with crippling inflation. It was divided internally by sectarian tensions. English relations with France and Scotland were in tatters. He had also devastatingly mismanaged his government in Ireland, Wales, and the north of England. His most significant policy was, of course, his break with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s. Henry made himself head of an independent Church of England, living through the birth of the Protestant interpretation of Christianity, which began with protests in Germany 8 years after Henry became king in England. Henry continued to cherish some Catholic traditions even after he rejected the Pope's authority. So there's an ongoing debate among Tudor historians today about just how much was Protestant and how much was Catholic in the early Church of England. However, although this was his most important long-term policy by far, Henry is more famous today because of his matrimonial misadventures. He married 6 times, and this is a profile of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, with whom he became parents to the famous Queen Elizabeth I. Anne Boleyn has been called the most important queen consort this country has ever had by Eric Ives, an academic who wrote 2 biographies of her, one in 1986 and another in 2004. She was, however, queen consort for only a relatively short period of time. Her coronation took place in June 1533, and she was executed 3 years later in May 1536. Anne, who had a sharp and witty sense of humour even in moments of extremis, allegedly joked shortly before her execution that it meant the people would have no difficulty in finding a nickname for her. She would, she said, be remembered as Anne sans tête, or Anne without a head. But instead, it was the brevity of her time as queen, those 3 short years between 1533 and 1536, that led to her most enduring nickname, Anne of the Thousand Days. The sobriquet endured to become the title of a Broadway play, and later an Oscar-winning movie starring Genevieve Bujold and Richard Burton, and which, even 41 years after its release, remains praised by many as one of the best movies inspired by the Tudors. If you have seen Anne of the Thousand Days or more recent dramatisations of Anne Boleyn on screen, like Natalie Dormer's performance in the first two seasons of The Tudors, you'll be familiar with largely sympathetic depictions of Henry VIII's second wife. These writers presented Anne as a passionate, nuanced, determined, and even heroic woman who was struck down mercilessly and unjustly by her husband and his advisors. But you may be wondering how different they seem to the much darker Anne offered in other forms of modern fiction. For instance, the best-selling novel The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory was turned in 2003 into a BBC TV show starring Jodie May, and then a Hollywood movie with Natalie Portman playing Anne, or Hilary Mantel's award-winning novels Wolf Hall and its sequel Bring Up the Bodies, which saw Clare Foy play Anne in the BBC limited series adaptation. The Other Boleyn Girl presents Anne Boleyn as a moral monster, dabbling in witchcraft, deceit, adultery, attempted murder, and possibly even incest, while Wolf Hall shows her as a callous, intellectually shallow self-obsessive who would have done much worse had she not been stopped by the novel's hero, Thomas Cromwell. These splits about Anne Boleyn in modern fiction echo a dichotomy about her that was really present almost from the beginning. For instance, a Catholic propagandist, Father Nicholas Sander, writing in the late 16th century, claimed Anne had been a Satanist and a witch who had fulfilled the devil's purpose by promoting England's break with the Vatican. For others, namely Protestant polemicists like John Fox or William Latimer, Anne Boleyn was almost a kind of saint, thanks to her generosity to the poor and her defence of evangelicals who wanted to see the Bible translated into English. How did they reach such differing conclusions? This video is an overview of Anne's remarkable personality and her equally remarkable life. Prior to the late 1530s, English parishes were not required to keep records of christenings, which means we have no idea, at least not precisely, when any of Henry VIII's 4 English wives were born. It seems fitting that Anne Boleyn literally came into the world sparking a debate. At one point, dates of birth as far-flung as 1499 and 1512 had been suggested, a huge 13-year margin of error. Today, most of Anne's biographers believe she was born around 1501, a minority working off a comment made by one of her daughter's early biographers and another by her stepdaughter's lady-in-waiting, argue in favour of the later date of 1507, so it's still a fairly sizable margin of 6 years. For what it's worth, I lean more personally to the minority on this one. I used to be very strongly in favour of 1507, and I still think that 1501 is far, far too early. But it's a matter of debate. There are good pieces on the respective arguments for the different dates that you can check out if you're interested in the works of Eric Ives, Antonia Fraser, Alison Weir, Clare Ridgway, Amy Licence, Lauren McKay, Marie-Louise Bruce, Hester Chapman, and Retha Warnock. Before we go any further, I should just point out that, as I said, this is being recorded during lockdown in the UK, and you might hear some discordant noises that sound like pots and pans being banged in an ad hoc military parade. Those are children who live in my neighbourhood. It's not that I'm being besieged. I just thought I would put that out there in case you thought that I was in some sort of carnival. So, today, there is a very curious move among some of Anne's defenders to describe her as a commoner who rose tenaciously to great heights from a humble beginning. The basis of this is that her father didn't have a full noble title at the time of her birth, so he wasn't a baron, viscount, earl, marquis, or duke. However, in terms of understanding the interplay of gentry and nobility in the early 16th century, that really doesn't seem that important when you know the dynamics of those groups. To use more modern parlance, Anne Boleyn definitely was not entitled to carry a placard reading, "We are the 99%. Her family were extremely wealthy and well connected. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was an esteemed diplomat as well as apparently an athletic jouster. Crucially, he was a gifted linguist who was trusted on many diplomatic missions abroad, firstly by Henry VII and then by Henry VIII. Through his mother, Lady Margaret Boleyn, Thomas was heir presumptive to the Irish earldom of Ormond, one of the most prestigious and ancient titles in the British Isles aristocracies. The 1515 will of his grandfather, Lord Ormond, makes it very clear, I think, that Thomas Boleyn was the grandson he wanted to inherit the family title. Anne's mother, Lady Elizabeth, was said to be very beautiful. She was certainly well connected, being a daughter to the Duke of Norfolk. This, of course, made Anne a Howard on her mother's side, one of the most powerful families in the English nobility, and the Butler family on her father's, one of the most powerful in the Irish. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, has a generally dire reputation. He's typically presented as a kind of monster, really, who essentially pimped out his daughters in order to create a career for himself. He certainly seems to have had a ruthless or tough streak, but no more so than many other Tudor nobles, which admittedly isn't setting the bar too high. He was, however, widely esteemed by philosophers in Europe, including the famous Erasmus of Rotterdam. While the dark legend of Thomas Boleyn is firmly entrenched as a part of English myth, I can't go too far off topic from this video. However, if you're interested in the latest research on the Boleyn men and the fact that they were almost nothing like the sycophantic sociopaths of modern legend, I can strongly recommend Dr. Lauren McKay's new book, Among the Wolves of Court. Dr. McKay wrote her PhD dissertation on the Boleyn men's political career. It's groundbreaking, well-researched and revisionist, as is George Boleyn, Tudor poet, courtier and diplomat, by Clare Ridgway and Claire Cherry on the younger generation. Back to Anne. If you ever get a chance to visit Hever Castle in Kent, I would strongly recommend that you do. It's excellent. It is excellently curated by its supervisor, Dr. Owen Emerson, and as one of the Boleyn family's surviving homes, the staff do a wonderful job of preserving this stunningly beautiful castle as a monument to Anne and her family. I very fortunately had the opportunity of a private tour last summer, I think. Yes, it was last summer. And it is just a totally extraordinary place. And very moving, I think. There's still a real sense of it having been a home. She had at least 4 siblings that we know about, Thomas and Henry, who both sadly died as children, and Mary and George, who, like Anne, survived into adulthood. Although she came to love Hever and to see it as something of a refuge later in her life, Anne doesn't seem to have spent too much time there when she was a child. Sometime in the 1510s, Anne's father Thomas was on a diplomatic mission to the Netherlands, which was then ruled by the Austrian royal house of Habsburg. The Habsburg emperor had delegated ruling the Netherlands to his capable and cultured daughter, the Archduchess Margaret. The Archduchess was so impressed by Thomas Boleyn that after negotiations had ended, she offered to take one of his daughters into her household as a ward. It was a fairly standard part of early modern aristocratic child rearing to foster a child, if possible, with another well connected family, and to score an invite for a daughter to be educated by the Habsburgs was a coup. Young Anne went to the Archduchess's household, which was a cultured and elegant establishment, where she seems to have begun developing her interest in the arts. She may also have started some Latin lessons there, although later in life Anne would complain that her Latin wasn't as good as she would like it to be. It's hard to tell. Her daughter Elizabeth apparently used to pull a trick where she'd claim she wasn't very good at a language, then stun everyone later by proving herself fluent in it and lapping up the surprised compliments. So that might have been a family trait. However good Anne's Latin was, there is no debate on her French. She was fluent to the point that it was later remarked that if you hadn't known better, you'd assume she was French. This was largely because after Henry VIII's younger sister married the King of France, English girls were moved to Paris to attend her. Anne was to stay in France until the early 1520s, attending the pious Queen Claude and coming to greatly admire the king's sister Marguerite, who was the patroness of scholars and philosophers in Paris who experimented with the new ideas coming out of the Protestant protests starting in the neighbouring German states. France, of course, ultimately remained predominantly Catholic, yet it was an exciting, stimulating intellectual milieu for the young Anne Boleyn. She returned to England in the 1520s, where she joined the royal household. Henry VIII had been married for over a decade to Catherine of Aragon, a pious Spanish princess who was also the Habsburg Emperor's aunt. Tragically, all of Henry and Catherine's children had either died in infancy or in the womb, except their precocious daughter, Princess Mary. At the time the royal couple had first married in 1509, there had been sermons preached against it by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, like a very small minority, objected to the wedding because Catherine of Aragon had previously been married to Henry's elder brother, Prince Arthur, who died during an epidemic in 1502. The biblical book of Leviticus forbids marriages between a brother-in-law and his widowed sister-in-law, but the Pope intervened at the time to point out that such marriages seem to be encouraged in Deuteronomy, another book of the Bible. This tangled web is important for later, I promise. Unlike in France, the English royals were not dabbling with new Protestant ideas. Indeed, Henry VIII was so repulsed by the idea of a split in Christianity that he had even written a book arguing that the Pope's position as head of the church was the rock on which true faith could be built. As for Anne, she became the toast of court society back in England. She apparently had a beautiful singing voice, which was useful since a lot of upper class entertainment at the time centered on music. She was also an excellent dancer. She was a superb dresser, with even one of her future enemies calling her the glass of fashion, the rose of state. She was of medium height, with dark hair, high cheekbones, and beautiful dark eyes, which many observers agreed were her best feature. Beauty is very much in the eyes of the beholder, and this is true of Anne. Hundreds of years after her death, the great French novelist Alexandre Dumas repeated a fantastically silly legend that Anne had been so beautiful that the noblemen of England fought duels over who could own a vial of her bathwater. Alas, like most of Dumas' best stories, it doesn't seem to have possessed so much as a nodding acquaintance with reality. And I say that as a lifelong fan of his Three Musketeers. One Italian diplomat heard from Parisians who may have known Anne when she was younger that she was very beautiful. A Venetian diplomat who saw Anne in 1532 infamously judged her appearance quite dismissively by saying she is not one of the handsomest women in the world. A Cambridge scholar who also met her said, with a cocktail of a backhanded compliment, that Anne was compétente belle, meaning quite or sufficiently beautiful. We have sources that say she was beautiful, but that some of Henry VIII's previous love interests, like his former mistress Elizabeth Blunt, had been better looking. Another describes her as young and good looking. A family friend said that there were other women at court who were more beautiful. So there you have it. Very beautiful, quite beautiful, attractive, not beautiful. Beauty in the eye of the beholder. Of course, a very famous legend about Anne Boleyn is that she had 6 fingers on one hand. This is repeated in many popular histories and tour guides, but it was actually conclusively disproved in a 1989 book, The Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn, published by Cambridge University Press, written by Professor Retha Warnock. She compiled all the eyewitness accounts of Anne Boleyn's appearance to show that none of them mention the extra finger, and that the first mention of it dates from the aforementioned propaganda tract written 40 years after her death by Father Nicholas Sander, the same writer who claimed she was a satanic witch who had a mole the size of a strawberry on her neck, a third nipple, and the beginnings of a cleft palate. The great nephew of one of Anne's ladies in waiting mentioned that he had heard a story that one of Anne's fingernails had a kind of dip or line in it, although even this is only mentioned in one source. So, sorry to Anne, the 6-fingered, 3-nippled, goiter-sporting, jaundice-loving Satanist, but there's no evidence of anything quite so exotic. For the real Anne in the early 1520s, as a young, well-connected and well-educated girl, there were several discussions of marriage. Distant Irish cousins had objected to the family's earldom passing to her English-born father, and to mend the rift between the two sides of the family, there was talk of marrying Anne to her handsome Irish cousin, Lord James Butler. She also seems to have been quite seriously infatuated with Lord Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland's heir, who was in love with her and proposed marriage, but who eventually caved to family pressure to marry Lord Shrewsbury's daughter as originally planned. A married poet, Sir Thomas Wyatt, seems to have been besotted with Anne, and his poems are very beautiful. Unfortunately, people seem to think that every single one of those poems must have been written about Anne. I sometimes imagine the ghosts of other Tudor courtiers saying there were other women around at the time, you know. Only one of Wyatt's poems, Noli Me Tangere, is definitely about Anne Boleyn, and interestingly for us, it points to two things. I think unreciprocated infatuation by the poet, and crucially, that all other suggestions of suitors had fallen away because the king had fallen for Anne himself. Dating this romance is difficult, but it seems that after Catherine of Aragon passed the menopause in about 1524, both the king and his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, considered citing the text from Leviticus to have the royal marriage annulled. Henry could then remarry elsewhere to father a son as heir to the throne. Initially, the pro-French Cardinal Wolsey seems to have suggested that the next queen could be a French princess, most likely Princess Renée de Valois. These discussions were kept in strictest confidence, with even Queen Catherine initially knowing nothing about them. How much Anne knew is debatable, but it seems likely that at this stage she too, like most of the country, knew nothing. Henry pursued Anne with the intention of making her his next mistress. It's worth noting that most sources from the time, even those hostile to her, do not seem to suggest that she or even her family were exactly delighted by this development. We assume it was a medieval version of honour to be the king's mistress, but in fact, many great aristocratic families seem to have recoiled at the idea of having anybody else's hand-me-downs, which is a horrible phrase. If you look at Henry VIII's other mistresses, none of them married any higher than a baron, and which was the lowest of the 5 rungs of the aristocracy, and most of them married minor country landowners. I think Anne and her family planned a better marriage for her, as evidenced by the earlier discussions with James Butler and Henry Percy. Anne's father even seems to have taken the extraordinary step of moving her away from the court and back to Hever Castle. Henry's love letters to Anne, which survive, do not initially suggest she was particularly enthusiastic, and given the difficulties of 16th century travel, moving her far away to Kent suggests the Boleyns were seriously trying to get her away from the king. Added to this was the fact that there is a very, very strong possibility, and slightly disgusting one, that Henry had already slept with Anne's married elder sister Mary. There are a few modern historians who doubt this rumoured affair between Henry VIII and Mary Boleyn ever took place. Not long after Anne's rise to prominence, her family's enemies even spread the ridiculous accusation that Henry had seduced her mother as well. So there are understandable questions about the reliability of the sources regarding Mary. Most historians do believe a brief fling with the married Mary took place in the early 1520s, possibly the late 1510s, although it's very hard to tell because there's really only one, or at a stretch 2 pieces of documentation that unambiguously suggest it. Again, that's a matter for another debate. What seems clear is that around 1526 and 1527, the Boleyns were quite aware that a passing romantic interest from a married monarch was in fact something of a poisoned chalice when it came to success and respectability. If Anne became Henry's mistress, everything the Boleyns subsequently achieved would be snickeringly attributed to her bedroom antics. And even worse, if the relationship ended badly, they could all be ruined. Anne's refusal to become Henry's mistress was later interpreted as the result of almost clairvoyant manipulation, whereby she manipulated him into proposing to her. She would have had to possess nearly psychic powers to do that, but it is certain that when Henry's seduction transformed into a proposal of marriage, Anne ultimately accepted. She still did not want to consummate the match, preferring to wait until marriage, a decision which became increasingly difficult as Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon didn't take the months thought, but 6 years to accomplish. Referred to at the time as the King's Great Matter, The royal divorce was technically an annulment, since Henry insisted that because of Catherine of Aragon's previous marriage to his late brother, their own marriage had always been in contravention of God's law, and that God had subsequently punished the king and queen by denying them a healthy son. Catherine of Aragon, not surprisingly, resisted her demotion bravely every single step of the way, and her Habsburg relatives made sure that the Pope, Clement VII, would not give King Henry the verdict he wanted. There's a tendency in history to let hindsight write it for us, to assume that things which are clear to us now were clear to people at the time, and that certain character traits were eternal rather than developing. In Anne's case, there is an assumption that she was active, dominant in politics from the moment she entered the limelight. Rather, it seems that this developed over time. At least initially, she seemed quite content to trust in the boasts made by her fiancé and his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, namely that she would be queen soon. She even refused to involve herself in an early plot to oust Cardinal Wolsey from favour, despite the fact that some of the plotters included her father and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. She had some health concerns too, and very nearly died during the sweat epidemic of 1528. She had retreated to safety, we might, tongue-in-cheek, call it social distancing, at Hever Castle when this mutation of the plague that was famous for the speed with which it could kill caught her. For a time, it looked very much like Anne might join the thousands of victims, which included her brother-in-law, Sir William Carey. She rallied, and later used her burgeoning influence to ensure her widowed sister Mary received a generous widowhood settlement. As the great matter dragged on, Anne Boleyn also began to flex her political muscles. She had always been intelligent, and with the influence now open to her because of her romance with the king, it was perhaps inevitable that she would marry her mind to her new opportunities. She did nothing to help Cardinal Wolsey when he lost the king's favour. A French diplomat reports that she did visit Wolsey when he was ill, but that was manners rather than substance because she had clearly convinced herself that Wolsey was the reason for the Pope's dithering on the divorce. Her French upbringing came to the fore, and her intellectual inquisitiveness resulted in her lending her support to those sympathetic to the new Protestant religion. She even had Protestant texts smuggled into the country and took up her cudgels to save evangelicals and preachers condemned to burn to death for heresy. Years later, this protection was used to cast Anne as the first great Protestant heroine in England, but that again, I would argue, is hindsight, because by the time they were writing this, the split between the two strands of Christianity in the West was very clearly defined. The theological trenches between Catholicism and Protestantism had been dug. But the generation Anne belonged to was somewhere between universal Catholicism and a solidified separate Protestant faith. This was a generation of spiritual transition. So, despite her growing animosity towards the Vatican, Anne Boleyn continued to the end of her life to hold beliefs which we would today recognize as predominantly Catholic. She continued to express an interest in going on pilgrimage to sites associated with veneration of the Virgin Mary. She kept saints' days. She believed passionately in the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation in regards to the Eucharist, and she believed in purgatory and prayers for the dead. Some of Anne's prayer books still survive. The one on display at Hever Castle, which is photographed here, is a gorgeous testament to her sense of Christianity, and it contains images like the Assumption and coronation of the Blessed Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven, which you can see on the right page. She did, however, hold certain evangelical and strongly reformist views as well. She came to champion seeing the Bible translated into English rather than Latin. She wanted more money to be diverted from the church to hospitals and schools. And she increasingly came to resent the Pope, which of course may have been for the obstacles his lack of decision on the divorce put in her way. There is evidence that by about 1531, Anne was mentally struggling with the campaign to make her queen. She once complained in a moment of low spirits that she felt her youth slipping away, since she knew she couldn't make a good marriage if the one with the king now failed to materialise. Among the men Anne promoted to positions of prominence, none was more significant than the Cambridge intellectual Father Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532. Like Anne, Cranmer fully believed that a king should be head of the national branch of the church, and that monarchies should reject the Pope's authority over them. Harnessing a campaign of preachers and parliamentarians, English separation from loyalty to Rome materialised. Anne apparently put some of the books arguing for this split, technically illegal in England, directly into Henry's hands. After a state visit to France in 1532, or more technically to Calais, which is now part of France but was then under the control of England, Anne and Henry were almost certainly married, according to a chronicler on the feast day of St. Erkenwald, so that would put it on November 14th. It was at this point, apparently, that their relationship was at last fully consummated. As with most medieval royal weddings, there was a second ceremony, this one at the Palace of Whitehall on January 25th, by which time Anne was pregnant, although it's questionable if she knew at that early stage. A few weeks later, she was still mentioning going on pilgrimage to the great shrine at Walsingham to ask the Virgin Mary for a child. Archbishop Cranmer ruled that the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had never been legal. Catherine was allowed to keep a large retinue of servants, but since she never accepted that she was not legally queen, she was kept away from court and cruelly away from her teenage daughter, Mary. Anne was crowned queen in a glittering ceremony at Westminster Abbey in the early summer, and on September 7th she gave birth to her first child, the Princess Elizabeth. A girl, unfortunately, was not what anybody wanted. Happily, Anne Boleyn was a devoted and affectionate mother. As queen, she also had many successes. She was extremely generous to charity, increasing the royal household's contributions to the poor, and she also exerted significant influence over foreign policy and ecclesiastical matters. She did, however, endure great difficulties as well, which increasingly frayed her temper. Having been besotted with her for 6 years while they waited to get married, once they were, Henry VIII lost little time in taking a series of mistresses. There was a rift between Anne and her sister Mary when Mary eloped with a commoner, and their mother's health deteriorated significantly, quite possibly developing tuberculosis. The greatest heartbreak for the Queen was a series of miscarriages. She lost a child, carried nearly fully to term in the summer of 1534. There is some evidence to suggest that there may have been a miscarriage at a very early stage in the pregnancy in 1535, and without question she also lost a son in January 1536, which resulted in Henry screaming at her, calling it her fault, while she spent a spell of time in bed recovering what seems to have been a particularly hideous and physically traumatizing miscarriage. Queen Anne was strident, outspoken, clever, well-informed, and ambitious. She had also come to the consort's throne at a time of unprecedented change, and to many she was both the chief beneficiary and proponent of the country's break with Rome. Thus, both her circumstances and her personality won her many enemies. There was a small conservative cabal at court who remained loyal to her predecessor Catherine of Aragon, chief among them being the Habsburg Emperor's ambassador in London, Eustace Chapuis, who nonetheless was magnanimous enough to describe Anne as having the courage of a lion. No such magnanimity came from the Duke of Suffolk, who despised her, although Anne scored the comeback of the century when the Duke's wife died suddenly and he caused a scandal by marrying his son's fiancée. Anne and her clique had a field day, apparently, with quips at the Duke's expense. She also quarrelled with her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, which was not exceptional since many of his relatives seemed to have found the warrior Duke insufferable. The Duke of Norfolk complained that Queen Anne spoke to him worse than she would to one of her dogs, which was accurate if not in the way he intended, since she loved her dogs, and she hated him. For someone so intelligent, Anne had recurring moments of emotional obtuseness when it came to her stepdaughter, Mary. Catherine of Aragon died, most likely as a result of cancer, in 1536, and even before that, Anne seemed to think that she could win over Catherine's daughter to her side. How she ever thought that Mary would accept her as queen is baffling, no matter how much charm she initially poured out in pursuit of winning her over. Anne sincerely seems to have wanted Mary Tudor's approval. There is a mortifying anecdote that one day, when the two women were attending Mass at the same church, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting saw the ex-princess genuflecting to the altar, which she mistook as a curtsy in the exiting Anne's direction. The Queen, in her turn, was delighted when the lady-in-waiting told her this, and she sent a friendly message to teenage Mary, who replied that she couldn't have been curtsying to the Queen, since the only lawful queen in England was her mother Catherine, who was miles away. Instead, she had been genuflecting to God, my maker and hers. But if Anne, who Mary described pointedly as the king's mistress, wanted to put a good word in for her with Henry, then she would be very grateful. Anne was furious and retaliated by cheerleading Mary's demotion, which included having her moved to live as a dependent in the household of her infant half-sister, Anne's child, Elizabeth. In one particular fit of pique, Anne remarked that she would like to box Mary's ears. The most significant enemy Anne made was Thomas Cromwell, who had replaced Cardinal Wolsey as Henry VIII's chief advisor. Cromwell and Anne had both supported the break with Rome, but after the policy widened to include the closure of England's Catholic convents and monasteries, the Queen and the politician began to diverge. Cromwell, shrewd and ruthless, an organisational genius, had also made overtures of friendship to Henry's latest mistress, Jane Seymour, even offering the Seymours the use of his apartments. Matters came to a head when Queen Anne insisted that the wealth confiscated from the closing monasteries and nunneries should be put into funding new hospitals and schools, while Cromwell insisted that it was all directly deposited into the royal treasury. At Easter, Anne had one of her chaplains publicly preach a sermon which took as its text the biblical story of Queen Hester, a pious and holy queen who persuaded her husband to abandon Haman, his chief minister, a greedy extortioner persecuting a religious minority. The chaplain may have been preaching about the Old Testament, but it was not hard to see who he, or through him his royal employer, was alluding to. What happened next is more easily explained than why. Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace around lunchtime on May 2nd, 1536. She was told that she was accused of committing adultery with a palace musician, a servant called Mark Smeaton, and also with one of her husband's closest friends, Henry Norris. Smeaton had confessed, although as a commoner he could be tortured, and contemporary reports indicate that he may have been grievously racked on Cromwell's orders. Norris had been offered his life if he confessed, but he had refused, insisting that he and Anne were innocent. The councillors also told the Queen that she would be accused of adultery with a third man whose identity would be revealed to her later. Anne, like Henry Norris, protested her innocence and was taken by river to be imprisoned at the Tower of London. As Queen, she was not put in a dungeon, but kept in the royal apartments, which had been redecorated for her coronation 3 years earlier. She was forbidden from sending messages to her friends or family, and she was attended by servants who were loyal to Cromwell. The list of her accused lovers soon expanded, not from 2 to 3, but 2 to 7. They included her old admirer, the poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, who was also a friend of Cromwell's, who allegedly told Wyatt at the time of his arrest not to worry and that everything would be all right. The Queen's friend and ally, Sir Richard Page, was also arrested. Neither he nor Wyatt were brought to trial, and true to Thomas Cromwell's promise, both were later released, which led to the suspicion then and later that they had been arrested to neutralise 2 of the Queen's supporters, but also as red herrings to make Cromwell's investigations of the others seem more genuine and credible. A prominent landowner, Sir William Brereton, who had been a thorn in Cromwell's side for years, was also arrested, as was the handsome playboy Sir Francis Weston, and most horrifyingly, so too was Anne's brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, who was accused of committing incest with her. Despite the historical legend, she was not accused of witchcraft. The 5 men, Rochford, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton, were found guilty at short trials and beheaded outside the Tower of London on May 17th. The Queen rebutted the charges against her at her trial 2 days earlier, was found guilty, swore on the Eucharist and damnation of her soul that she was innocent during her final Mass, and was beheaded by a French swordsman at the Tower of London on May 19th. The next day, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour, and they married 10 days after that on May 30th. Why this truly extraordinary sequence of events happened is still a matter of debate, and I'll try and give you the different theories as best I can, as concisely and fairly as I can. Before going forward, I should just explain the reasons for this debate is that much of the evidence has been lost in the intervening centuries, quite a bit of it, frustratingly for historians. Particularly some of the trial records and Anne's itinerary in the months preceding her death were among the treasure trove of documents lost about 200 years later in an accidental fire at the Cotton Library in London. What Henry VIII did in publicly slaughtering his wife was unprecedented. Some modern observers, for reasons best known to themselves, cry context for this moral turpitude, but there's no context which adequately explains it. The public execution of a disgraced queen was hardly standard practice in European politics at the time. It hadn't happened in any other contemporary monarchy, nor had it happened in the English past. When Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, was accused of betraying her husband Henry II by plotting a rebellion, she had been imprisoned. French princesses who had been accused of adultery were forced to perform humiliating public parades of penance. English royals had fallen violently in military campaign before. Harold II, Richard the Lionheart, and Richard III. The deposed and inconvenient had disappeared, almost certainly to be quietly murdered, as had Edward II, Richard II, Henry VI, and Edward V. Henry IV's widow, Joanna of Navarre, had been accused of witchcraft, so she could be stripped of her fortune and then imprisoned. But the public execution of an anointed queen was unheard of. So, what happened? What reasons can the surviving evidence, which is fragmentary but still substantial, give us for explaining why this terrible fate landed on Anne Boleyn and those 5 men in May 1536? Explaining it has excited scholars for years, prompting the Oxford historian Stephen Gunn to quip that the debate over Anne's downfall constitutes academic trench warfare. The easiest explanation, of course, was that Anne must have been guilty. As Hilary Mantel, the best-selling novelist, put it, she must have given the appearance of being guilty of something in 1536. Mantel is the author of the Wolf Hall trilogy. The only historian who believes this in terms of being a specialist currently is Professor George W. Bernard, who articulated it in a 1991 paper and then again in his 2010 biography, Anne Boleyn, Fatal Attractions, published by Yale University Press. Professor Bernard argues that although many of the charges against Anne seem preposterous, and it is highly unlikely that she committed incest with her brother or adultery with all of the men accused, Bernard says, quote, "It remains my hunch that Anne had indeed committed adultery with Norris, probably with Smeaton, possibly with Weston, and was then the victim of the most appalling bad luck." This view, however, as I said, is very much in the minority, both now and at the time. A large part of Bernard's evidence for his theory rests on a very long poem written by a French bishop who was in London in 1536 but never saw Anne except from a distance. One crucial piece of evidence against the guilty theory is the trial itself, in which there were at least a dozen errors in the indictments against Anne, in which either she or her alleged lovers were nowhere near either the place they were allegedly having sex in or one another. Even as Anne was racked by uncertainty in her rooms in the Tower of London, her behaviour before her judges was calm. The Spanish ambassador applauded her answers in his letters, saying that she had rebutted all the charges against her very convincingly. King Henry's own joyous and repulsive behaviour during his wife's downfall, which included banqueting and feasting in nighttime river parties while the Queen was imprisoned, was described at the time with magisterial understatement as ringing badly in the ears of the public. I would say it does not exactly strike a convincing note to posterity either, especially when you compare this nautical riverbound good times to Henry's genuine rage and humiliation when he believed that his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, had taken a lover a few years later. Dr. Greg Walker does not believe Anne was guilty, but he thinks that her flirtatious, outgoing nature gave credibility to the charges against her. The next theory is one you might be familiar with, as it was included as a storyline plot point in The Other Boleyn Girl and also in season 2 of The Tudors, so it has quite a widespread reach through popular culture. It comes from a theory put forward in the 1980s by Retha Warnock, who argued that Anne's final miscarriage in January 1536 held the key. Professor Warnock argues the fetus Anne lost had been partially deformed, which resulted in the Queen being suspected of witchcraft, and those around her, including her homosexual brother, Lord Rochford, and his lover, the musician Mark Smeaton, of being sexual deviants, who had, according to the prejudices of the time, consorted with the Queen in other so-called unnatural activities, resulting in the monstrous demonic birth, as they would have seen it. However, there is very little evidence to support the idea that George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was homosexual, and almost nothing in the way of concrete evidence to clinch the idea that the King and Queen's lost child in January 1536 was somehow deformed. The most popular theory put forward initially by the late and much missed, Professor Eric Ives, and expanded upon by others brilliantly, is that Anne's death, to quote Ives, is explained by what happened not in the bedroom, but in the corridors of power. In this version of events, Anne Boleyn was the victim of a coup, with Thomas Cromwell moving to destroy her before she could destroy him. Cromwell also decided to destroy other enemies at court by accusing some of Anne's most influential supporters of being her lovers, then selecting a suitably weak and malleable servant like Mark Smeaton, who he could torture into providing the necessary fig leaf of legal evidence needed to begin the arrests. He then concocted the charges against Anne, which were, in Simon Schama's memorable turn of phrase, one part pornography, one part paranoia, to make sure no one would be tempted to speak out in her defence. Some proponents of this argument even believe that Cromwell was so sufficiently ruthless and persuasive that he actually managed to convince Henry that Anne was guilty, thus completing his coup and emerging from it as the king's unquestioned closest advisor. Finally, and perhaps most chillingly of all, is the conclusion of two of Henry's modern biographers, J.J. Scarisbrick and Derek Wilson, which holds that Henry knew his wife was innocent, that he wanted to be rid of her, and that he allowed his underling Cromwell to organise the case against her, once Henry's own obsessive, possessive fascination with Anne finally ended, as it so often does in the most tragic of cases, with, quote, devastating infatuation turning into bloodthirsty loathing for reasons we will never completely know. That's from Scarisbrick. And Wilson writes that the extremely cumbersome and illegal means used to bring Anne down somehow whiff of Henry's own cumbersome attempts to secure his first divorce, putting him at the centre of what happened in 1536, not Thomas Cromwell. It was neither Anne nor Cromwell who mattered, only Henry. In 2014, I wrote a book called A History of the English Monarchy, in which I said really ever calling it a love affair between Henry and Anne is questionable, I think even from the beginning. Henry had this slightly unhinged, possessive, obsessive attitude to her, and we know from many cases, many tragic cases, that sometimes that really obsessive love is a hair's breadth away from turning into destructive hatred, and I think, to me, that is what happened. But I have hopefully given you an overview of all the different views. I do think Cromwell had a huge role in it. I think he was allowed kind of free rein to go after her, but that in some way the order had to have come from Henry. So he seems to have allowed his servants and underlings to kind of pursue their own agendas as long as they did his work for them. I'm being very reductive in a huge debate in Tudor historiography, but hopefully that gives a decent overview. 9 years ago, I wrote a series of articles on Anne Boleyn's final days alive. I tried to make them informed and artistically enjoyable, readable was probably the best way. So informed and readable was what I was aiming for. Whether I did that is debatable. But those articles really do have such a special place in my heart because they unexpectedly kick-started my career and helped lead me to my wonderful agent. Historians are still, as hopefully you'll have seen with this, they are still divided between sympathy or suspicion when it comes to Anne Boleyn. I hope I have been honest in this video that my own views of her lean much more towards sympathy and admiration, while being fair to the views of colleagues who are critical of her, whose work I would encourage you to read if you're interested too, because honest, well-informed debate is for me one of the best parts of history. In those articles on Anne Boleyn's execution, I thought back on what it is about her story that keeps pulling us back in, what continues to make the story of the Thousand Day Queen fascinating. And I would like to share that paragraph with you, as much as I might change certain things with that series when I look back on it. This, in a nutshell, is why I believe Anne Boleyn continues to intrigue, because the arc of her life is quite simply one of the greatest stories in European history. No one would dare write a story like Anne's and still hope to make it half as interesting or half as believable as what really transpired. Born into a life of aristocratic privilege, educated at the courts of two of the most powerful and magnificent empires in Christendom, nurtured in the decadent world of the European aristocracies, she had been a dazzling debutante, an accomplished courtier, a talented musician, and the muse of poets, songwriters, and playwrights. Glamour, sophistication, charm, and charisma had been hers in abundance. Then she had captured the attention of the most powerful sovereign ever to reign in the British Isles. For her, consumed by obsession and a desire to possess, he had turned the world upside down, and the continent had echoed to the sound of the roar she had created in her homeland. At long last, she had been crowned queen in splendour, in a dress shimmering with a county's worth of jewels and pearls. Archbishops had knelt before her, foreign rulers had showered her with gifts, evangelicals had celebrated her as God's chosen nymph, and for a moment the world had been hers. Then, with a gradient of catastrophe so unparalleled it still has the power to boggle the imagination, she was dragged from her throne and 1,000-roomed palace to be left kneeling alone in the sawdust, waiting for a sword to strike at the neck that had once inspired poetry and glittered with diamonds. And in the final crowning touch to the tragedy of her life, the most gallant knight in all the land, for want of a better phrase, Henry Norris, had laid down his life for her rather than besmirch her honour. Neither in Sparta, Troy, Babylon, Alexandria, or Camelot had there ever been a story quite like the Boleyn tragedy, nor would there ever be again. A little flowery, but I hope it still works. A man who witnessed Anne's composure at her execution wrote, "The Queen died boldly. God take her to his rest." I think that's a beautiful, succinct epitaph. I'd like to thank you for your time and listening to this. I really hope it's been halfway interesting. I would thoroughly recommend the works of other historians. If you're interested in Anne's story, I can leave a list below of books you might like. Most importantly, this is going out during the spring of COVID-19, so I would most especially like to wish you all a very safe few weeks. Thank you.